Hello, this is Mr. Blake, and this is the seventh installment in my grand review of getting ready for the AP Human Geography exam on May 5th, Cinco de Mayo. This unit encompasses really two big concepts, which is ethnicity, identity, and governments, especially the creation of states and countries and things. So it's a little broader. This one might be a little longer because there's more material to kind of cover in this one. But I'm just going to hit on some of the big stuff that you probably want to remember coming out of this unit. The first part was race and ethnicity, and you've got to know the difference between the two. Race is your biology. You have no control over that whatsoever. Your hair is the way it is, your eye color is the way it is. That's all DNA. You can't do anything about that. Ethnicity, though, is associated with your culture. And so, regardless of what your face looks like, it is those ideas like religion, like language, the history of your people, and so forth that really makes up your ethnicity. And that is one of the things that we will identify with, along with perhaps racial characteristics as well. That is how we get our self identity in groups. So, know the difference between those two. It may come up. Um, we also have to look at different kinds of societies that we may live in. If it were a homogenous society, we are largely all the same. That we all speak the same language, we practice the same heathen religion, we dress the same, we have the same food preferences. That is homogenous society. There are a couple of examples of this I gave you. Things like Iceland, Japan are considered homogenous societies where everybody there is pretty much the same. If you have a multi ethnic state, that means that you have lots of different ethnicities. They may speak different languages, practice different religions, come from different parts of the world, have different histories. Um, and that is going to make a different kind of society. It is often a little more unstable, for instance, than a homogenous society because if everybody's the same, we don't have much to fight over. But it could well be that we have different groups speaking different languages, different histories that may not particularly want to be in the same country together, and that could create chaos. The concept of shatter belts comes into play here. You have parts of the world where you have many different ethnicities, but they're divided up. They're not is in much contact with each other, usually because of topography. It's mountainous. It could be thick jungle. It could be whatever that would divide people up. And in shatter belts, you often have these groups sort of intermixed with each other, which is all great until somebody decides they need to make a country out of it. And as soon as that flag goes up, then everybody's going to decide, well, am I not this part of ethnicity? Do I want to be part of this country? Maybe I need my own country. And that often leads to territorial conflicts between groups. So, shatter belts, the Balkans Peninsula of Europe, the Caucasus Mountain region between Russia and the Middle East. Southeast Asia is often considered a shatter belt, where you have these sort of intermixings of all these different types of ethnicities. There's also the concept of nationality versus patriotism or country. Nationality is you're identifying with whatever ethnic group you tend to, see yourself as, and that is often based on language, religion, history, the elements of your culture. The idea of patriotism is pride in your country. And a country is not necessarily the same thing as a nationality. Country is something that has borders. It has a population. It has laws. It has some sort of government that can enforce those laws. It has independence or sovereignty. And absolutely nothing I said had anything to do with ethnicity. So, country and nationality are two separate things. Be careful. They may use those in questions and answers to fool you. Be careful. And it may well be that your nationality is not what you're patriotic about. It could well be that I am a very proud Kurd, but I'm not a particularly proud Iraqi, because Iraqi would be my country, but my Kurdness is my ethnicity. So that's the sort of thing to be watching out for there. Think about how race may play a role in societies, in countries, for instance. And again, think about policies that we might have put down, either that may divide or separate or, in some cases, persecute or oppress particular ethnicities or racial groups within a country. And I'm referring to here things like apartheid in South Africa, where you had a whole series of laws that divided the population along racial lines. There were black South Africans, white South Africans, and what they referred to as colored South Africans, which were mostly South Asians. But depending on what your skin color was, determined what kind of political rights you had, what kind of social rights you had. And so if you were black South African or colored South African, you didn't have the same rights as a white South African. And that was true through much of the 20th century. And that would be laws based on physical characteristics, race. You may be looking at things like the Jim Crow laws of the segregationist South, where there were laws on the books which restricted what you could and could not do if you were a black man or woman in the United States, again, through most of the 20th century. We may also be looking at policies. For instance, when we were talking about urbanization, redlining and blockbusting. Redlining, I'm not going to loan any money from anybody that comes from these zip codes or this part of town because I happen to know that that's a black part of town and I'm not going to loan them any money. So you're not looking at them as people as what their economics are. Are they wealthy, poor? You're looking at whether or not what color skin they have as to whether or not they should get a bank loan. Blockbusting, the idea of scaring people off so you can buy property cheap because you're threatening that some ethnicity or race is going to be moving into that area, and there go the land values and all that. All of this stuff is either ethnically or racially based, and so understand how that plays a role sometimes in society. Think about centrifugal and centripetal forces. I know this confuses everybody because they look alike. Centrifugal forces are things that pull countries apart, usually along ethnic lines. Centripetal forces are the things that help hold countries together. Things like we have a common religion or a common language, common history, to where we tend to still see ourselves as a group rather than tearing apart along ethnic lines, that we speak different languages, that we practice different religions, that we have a different history. So keep those two in mind. Almost guaranteed something will come up where you'll be able to use centrifugal and centripetal forces, either in an essay or in the multiple choice. Almost guaranteed. Know what a nation state is and a stateless nation. Nation state is a homogenous state. Culturally, it is all uniform. It's the same. And that is, again, considered a centripetal force. That's something that would hold a country together. We're all the same. Whereas if we are a stateless nation, we are a group that identifies as a different nationality than perhaps the majority of the people that make up the country. We speak a different language. We practice a different religion. We have different customs and culture. We have a different history, but we're part of this other country. And maybe we don't want to be part of this country. We see ourselves as something different. That can be a centrifugal force tearing a country apart along ethnic lines. Examples: Kurdistan in Iraq, Quebec in Canada. You could say the Catalans and the Basques of Spain. Both of these would very much like, all of these would like to have their own country, but currently they do not. They're part of somebody else. And so that creates a great deal of friction in these countries because these ethnic groups are not getting along. Think about ethno-nationalism, which is often tied to this idea of breakaway states or stateless nations, where we are identifying ourselves nationally as a nationality, a completely separate nationality from the larger group because we see ourselves as different. Again, Catalans are a really good example in Spain, that they have really developed a political idea of who they are based on the fact that they see themselves as this separate nationality. Think about the role of language and religion in all of this. That, again, most of the time when we identify ourselves as a nationality, the very first thing that we base it on is our language. I'm a French speaker, I'm a German speaker, I'm a Spanish speaker, whatever. That becomes our nationality. It could be religion, that we divide ourselves along religious lines, and that is the group that we associate with. The big thing with nationality is how are they seeing themselves as something different? And that's what holds that group together. Balkanization and devolution, also talking about the breakup of states. In balkanization, it is a country that tears itself apart, usually through violence, that states break away and are now fighting over their borders. But for whatever reason, the folks in there are splitting apart, and it's usually through violence. In devolution, there's usually some legal means that is causing the split. That these two, let's say, different ethnic groups are part of a country, but they really don't want to be part of the same country. And so they agree they're just going to split it up. And this will become a new country. This will become a new country. Nice knowing you. There's usually no violence associated with it, or very, very little. A pretty good example is the breakup of Czechoslovakia. We now have the Czech Republic, we have Slovakia. Used to be one country. They decided, hey, look, we're two different ethnic groups. Why are we in the same country? Doesn't make any sense. Let's split up. And they did. Irredentism is tied to this whole idea of balkanization. Irredentism is the idea that you claim somebody else's territory because that used to be your territory. So, through history, through migration, through whatever process happened, that part of what you see as part of your country is now controlled by somebody else, and you want it back. And so this often forms the cause of border wars between countries. If you look at the Ukrainian Russian mess of today, a lot of that is irredentism, that Russians are claiming territory within Ukraine because they see that as traditionally Russia. Historically, it was part of Russia. They want it back. And so they're fighting over it right now. All the Yugoslav wars were irredentist movements that they broke apart and then were fighting over the borders inside what used to be Yugoslavia to figure out where these countries are really going to exist. Where are we drawing the lines? And because often they had 400, 500, 600-year old claims to somebody else's territory, that became the battlefield that we're going to try to take it back. So, irredentism has come up on a regular basis. Recognize it for what it is. Think about some of the things that are maybe related to these concept of ethnicity. I already had made mention of things like migration. When people migrate, you've got different people moving into different areas, right? And that can create ethnic strife as you have different ethnic groups coming in contact with each other. Think about religion, changes in religion. That can often drive divisions between people. So look at the role of language and religion in these things. Remember the whole Rimland Heartland thing. That was Spikeman in his idea of the Heartland, that it was going to be some sort of Eurasian group that was going to become the world dominators because they had access to Europe, Africa, and Asia. And so they were going to be the ones that were going to unite that in some sort of like big risk game. And because they would control all that territory, they would rule the world. If you happen to be Russian, that sounded like a great idea because that sure sounded like they were describing you. Now, there was another group that is Mackinder, who, I'm sorry, Mackinder did Rimland. Thought I'd gotten them wrong. Rimland was the idea that it's the coastal countries, and especially places like Europe, when you're looking at England and France and Spain and Portugal and even the Americans over there in North America, that because they are a coastal maritime people, because they control powerful navies, those navies can then control all the oceans of the world, and they will end up controlling the world because they need to protect those trade routes. They're going to be able to build these powerful trade routes, which is going to build the industries, which is going to put them in charge of everything. And so this is kind of tied to both state construction and this idea of the spread of ethnicity, the spread of empire, and things like that. So keep in mind Rimland versus Heartland theory. It may come up. And then a related idea is the idea of spheres of influence and buffer states. Buffer states are little tiny countries that are stuck, unfortunately, usually between two big powers. And neither one of those big powers wants the other one in control of the little countries. And so they kind of keep them there as bumpers between each other. In that way, they're not exactly on each other's borders, and that might create a war. They have this country stuck in between them. Again, they are usually not very powerful states, and sometimes they pass under control of one side or the other. But they're usually there as kind of to form almost a neutral zone between two powerful states. Those are your buffer states. Spheres of influence are countries that are not controlled directly, like being colonies or something, but they're under the influence of some major power. Big ideas here would be something like the Soviet Union and its control of Eastern Europe after World War II. Eastern Europe would be considered their sphere of influence. They were pulling the strings in all those countries, even though they're still considered independent countries. They were still really answerable to the Soviet Union. They wouldn't do anything that would step out of line with what the Soviets wanted. Same thing with Latin America and the Americans, the United States. We generally were seen as having a sphere of influence over all Latin America, for instance. Yeah, they are independent countries, but most of them would not do anything that would potentially anger the United States because we were the big power and we had a great deal of influence inside their economies and their politics and that sort of thing. So keep that in mind. Sometimes they're referred to as satellite states. The Soviet control of Eastern Europe, that relationship was much more like a satellite state. It's independent, but it's totally controlled by that great power. Poland wasn't going to do anything that was not what the Soviets wanted. Bulgaria was not going to do anything that was going to make the Soviets angry. So they were satellite states. They had very little independence, even though they were still considered independent states. Keep that in mind. Know your international organizations. These are groups of usually three or more countries that have come together for some purpose. Um, so think about things like the United Nations. The United Nations is out there to provide a diplomatic outlet for countries to deal with conflicts or grievances or whatever, where they can settle things diplomatically rather than with a gun. The United Nations also provides a lot of international support and things like famine and healthcare and things like that, where they're trying to deal with global issues that often a single country really can't fix or address on their own. So that is their role as a sort of multinational organization, international organization. Um, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is a multi nation organization, in this case, created for defense. That it was created by the United States as an alliance of nations against the Soviet Union and their allies. And it is still in existence to this day. It's mostly made up of European states, along with the Canadians and the Americans. And it is still an alliance that is in existence. And you may hear a lot about it in the news, but it may also appear on the exam as well. You have other groups like the EU. This is mostly Western and Eastern European countries, not all, but most of them, that have come together for economic purposes, integration, as well as political integration. Their long term plan is to create sort of a United States or Federation of Europe. And there's a number of states that belong to it. It's an ongoing thing. Think about the African Union. It's unlikely it would ever come up, but this is another group that is trying to unite African countries into a single economic bloc. To encourage trade amongst their members and to grow the economies of African states. So it's a group that's come together to try to build up those economies. It could be mentioned. Think about things like, although not necessarily an international organization, things like OPEC, the countries that have come together that are big oil producers. They're a cartel, which means that they've come together to control price, distribution, and the production of, in this case, oil and natural gas. And so you might look at something like OPEC. The USMCA, which used to be known as NAFTA, and probably in most books it's still called NAFTA, is an economic group of the North American countries, Mexico, United States, and Canada. They've come together to create a free trade zone. Other things like that would be like the ASEAN, which is another economic group, again, trying to end trade barriers and grow economies in that part of the world. So know your multi country organizations. Going back a little to ethnicity, remember genocide and ethnic cleansing. Why are they different? And I would know some of the historical examples. In genocide, you have one ethnic group trying to eliminate completely another ethnic group, and generally you do that by killing them all. And so when we're looking at genocide, we're looking at the mass murder of a group based usually on their ethnicity in some way. Examples would be the Armenian genocide in the Turkish Empire, World War One, the Holocaust against Jewish populations, amongst others, in World War II, the Rwandan Civil War, which degenerated into a genocidal war of Hutu versus Tutsi. Um, in dealing with things like ethnic cleansing, look at the Yugoslav wars when Yugoslavia broke apart and they were trying to create these ethnic homelands for their people. They would often go in and either force them to leave or kill them. Either way, at the end, so long as they aren't there anymore, that was considered a good thing. So that was ethnic cleansing. You might look at some modern ones. The Rohingya issue down in Burma. You have the Rohingya, which are Muslim Burmese, and most of the rest of Burma is Buddhist. And the government there has decided that the Rohingya are a threat because they are a different ethnicity, culture. So they have set it up to where the Rohingya are no longer citizens. They don't have any civil rights, and in fact, they're not even recognized as people within the borders of Burma, which means they are highly oppressed. They have been killed. Some have pointed that to being ethnic cleansing because they're trying to force them out of the country. So that might be something that comes up. You might look at Darfur, which is in the country of Sudan, and it is an area that is ethnically more sub Saharan African than the sort of Saharan culture that we would see in Northern Africa. The government there has decided to discriminate against, oppress, and now are killing their own people in the Darfur region and trying to drive them out. That could be another example of ethnic cleansing, for instance, from the modern world. So if you see any mentions of these, understand what's going on there, and that might help answer some questions. Going back to more government stuff, remember the difference between federal, confederal, and unity governments. Federal means you got those two layers of government. You got like states and the national government itself, and they write laws and they can enforce laws. Just like here in Texas, we've got our governor and our legislature. They write and pass laws and enforce laws, but we also have the laws of the United States, which is that national level of government. So they share those powers. That's the federal system. There's a federation of these states underneath this national government. Confederal means that the states have a whole lot more power than that national government, meaning that they probably are controlling most of the stuff that's going on in their borders, and that national government has very weak powers, maybe just specifically to do with maybe trade or something like that, whether we're going to war or not. That may be the only thing that they can decide. So the power is at the lower level, at the states and provinces, and not so much at the national level. Unity means that there is no really local government, that there is a national government that writes and passes all the laws, and that is where government resides. And look at the examples like France, for instance. There's the French Assembly and the French President. That is where the power in France lies. There are independent, individual departments within France, but they don't pass laws. They don't write laws. They just enforce the laws that the national government comes up with. So that's an example of a unity government. Um, Know your different types of governments. You have democracies where people take part in elections, there's multiple parties. You have a choice of candidates. This would be the United States, Canada, most of Europe, South Africa, Australia, Brazil, you name it. A lot of these countries are going to be democracies where there's actual free elections where citizens get to choose what kind of governments they're going to have. You can have things that kind of look like that but aren't really. Those are your anocracies. Anocracies look like a republic or they look like some sort of democracy, but in fact, they're usually a dictatorship. That they go through the motions of democratic government, but in fact, power is usually held by a single person. And so they may have elections, but there's only one name on the ballot. So, what kind of election is that? You didn't really have a choice, did you? You may see things like monarchies. This is where power is passed through a single royal family. They may have power, they may not have power. If they're an absolute monarchy, that means that the monarch, the king or the queen, actually holds political power. There's still a few of those left in the world, but most of them are now constitutional monarchies, which means the power has been taken away from the monarch and is usually held by something like a parliament or a prime minister. That's where real power is. But the dynasty may still exist. And often they are there to represent their country around the world. They become the face. Queen Elizabeth II of Great Britain is a pretty good example of that. Think about authoritarian governments. These are your dictatorships, oligarchies, where there's a small group of people that hold power, often military leaders. That's a junta, for instance. So if you see a government where everybody's wearing a uniform, it's probably some sort of military dictatorship or a junta. And then you have your totalitarian states, which want total control over their citizens. North Korea is a really good example of this. Cuba is a pretty good example of this, where there are no political rights, there are no civil rights. You do as you are told. There's usually a secret police spying on you on a regular basis. There are no freedoms in that kind of country. You do as you are told. And then again, that is totalitarian, total control. Easy way to remember that. Remember your shapes: elongated, protruded, fragmented, compact. Remember all of those. If you don't remember them, look them up and be able to identify a shape. If they just gave you a country, you may have to identify what kind of shape that is. So make sure that you look over that stuff. I don't expect a lot of it, but I expect at least one. So keep that in mind. And related to that is enclave, exclave. An enclave is a territory inside another country. So it could be an independent state or part of somebody else, but it's located inside you. You would be the perforated state, and they would be the enclave inside you. An exclave is a part of a country that's not attached, but it's on the same piece of land. So, for instance, Alaska in North America is an exclave of the United States. The rest of us is kind of down here in 48, and then we got Hawaii sitting over there. We don't really count them anyway. So, keep that enclave, exclave going as an idea. UNCLOS. We've not had an UNCLOS essay question, and I am expecting one sometime. UNCLOS, the United Nations laws on the sea, covers things like EEZs, those exclusive economic zones that countries can claim water territory as well as land territory. Now, it comes out of disputes that were up in the Arctic Ocean between us and the Soviet Union and the Norwegians and the Canadians and stuff, because everybody had water claims off the coast that this is our territorial waters, and they often overlapped. So they needed some sort of treaty to establish exactly how that was going to work. And this is where they created the EEZs. And the EEZs are a zone that go out about 200 miles off your coastline, and you have exclusive economic control over that area. Well, that's great until you have a whole bunch of countries that overlap in those 200 miles offshore. And the big topic of discussion nowadays is not the Arctic so much as it is the South China Sea, because that is a sea surrounded by states. And each one of them have those EEZs off the coast, and they often overlap. And increasingly, this has become an economic and military and political issue between the Chinese, the Japanese, the Vietnamese, Indonesians, Taiwanese, Filipinos, and everybody else that has water claims, because there's a whole bunch of uninhabited islands out in that sea, and they claim the islands as well. Well, if you start putting people on those islands, they become your islands, right? And that is what's happening right now, especially with the Chinese. They're starting to set up military bases all over the South China Sea. And because of those bases, they're making those water claims from those islands. And so this is a big issue. It is something that I would expect them to talk about somewhere in the exam, talking about borders and territorial claims by states and things like that. One last bit here, and then we will be moving on, are issues like borders. Know your borders, your geometric border, physical border, cultural border, the antecedent, subsequent, consequent, and my favorite, relic. Antecedent when we first draw the lines, subsequent when we kind of figure out more what's physically there, so we can alter it to maybe manage to take into account the physical features. Consequent is when we start looking at cultures in that area. Maybe we need to redraw so we can keep these people together or keep these two separate. Relic is when that border no longer exists. It's erased off the map, but I bet it still has some sort of impact on the people that live there. And gerrymandering. Remember gerrymandering? That may also come up as well. Gerrymandering is a uniquely American thing where every time we redraw the boundaries of our congressional districts, we go through this whole process based on our census data that changes in populations. We have to redraw the boundaries. So we have things like reapportionment, which means some states get more congressmen and some states lose congressmen. So that's why the boundaries have to redraw. And then we've got to take into account shifts in population within the city. So the states, we got to redraw the boundaries. That's where redistricting comes in, and that is where the gerrymandering starts, because we can draw those boundaries that favor one political party over another. And if that's the case, you may be looking at things like packing districts where you're trying to get as many of your opponents' voters into one district. And yeah, they're going to win that district, but you've taken them out of all the other districts. So maybe you're going to win all the rest of them because they don't have any sort of political power in any of those other districts. The other is to fragment them into all these different districts to where they don't have a majority or even really close to a majority anywhere, maybe 30, 40% of the population. That means that those folks that are in those districts, that 30 or 40%, no matter what they do, they're not going to win any of those elections. And if you spread them out just right, it's entirely possible you could win all the elections, even though your opposition makes up a significant part of the population. They're no longer represented in Congress. This has been an issue in the United States for a very long time, really going back to the beginnings of the United States. And it is an issue every time we have a census, any year that ends in zero. So we're about 2 years in from the last census, and they're now using that data to redraw these congressional boundaries. And it is a big political issue. It is something you may see as a question in the multiple choice, and heaven forbid it ever becomes an essay question, but it could very well be. So I would look over how to gerrymander, what's the idea behind gerrymandering, what is the effect of gerrymandering. Okie doke. And that is enough on states and ethnicity.